Then hello everyone. Thank you, Romain, for this very interesting and very comprehensive talk. Bea, Miloš, and I are very happy to discuss your paper. But yeah, whoops, how do I do this? Thanks. Yeah, for giving a very quick summary, and then adding on some points because we found it rather difficult to add something to this very comprehensive overview that already included 3 different opinions. And I will talk a bit about trade-offs, and Bea will talk about the core periphery, differentiated challenges, and at the end, Miloš will give a political overview about the current situation. So so the goal of this paper was to provide an overview about the academic discussion about the role of central banks and financial supervision in the face of ecological challenges, and you identified 3 different approaches or narratives within this discussion. And in your paper you then nicely elaborated on the rationale and the main policy proposals, but also the implications of this kind of views. And what is crucial, or like maybe the takeaway message, that it really depends on the worldview and on the understanding of the economy itself to come to different conclusions about the role. And finally, it is all about coordinating institutions, or the entire institutional setup. What kind of role central banks actually can have. So maybe I'll skip this, we already heard this in detail. So I thought I will go a bit more into trade-offs about the proposals, and I feel now in your talk you already elaborated more on many of those things that I will say. But in your paper, you mentioned, as a main trade-off that often is put forward to is, holding the borrowing costs low and price stability, because this is like kind of clashing within the mandates. But of course, it also depends on what kind of approach you would take and what kind of proposals you would have to discuss the trade-offs. And I thought it would be helpful to distinguish between the 2 mandates, but you already presented them in your discussion in detail. And so I'll skip this too, to have more time for the more important part. So a post-Keynesian view on those mandates would maybe or not on the mandates, but on inflation and interest rates might be interesting to then talk about trade-offs of the proposals. So in a post-Keynesian view, inflation also inhibits this problem that measuring inflation is a bit fuzzy, because we don't really distinguish between money, income, and capital. And on top of that, inflation also inhibits conflict about income shares. So increasing interest rates only attacks on the consequences, but not really tackles the real issues of or origins of inflation. And so inflation targeting is very problematic in the view of post-Keynesians, and also neglects other socioeconomic goals. While financial stability within post-Keynesians economics really puts an emphasis on the role of the lender of last resort of central banks, because this is also very crucial to the creation of money. And not only money is endogenous, but also the risk of that loans default. So there's less supervision is less potential, because it can only then identify it when it's already kind of too late. And so if we now look at the proposals that the different approaches bring, it would be interesting to assess step one by one, and then in the view of those 2 mandates and post-Keynesian economics, but we don't have the time. But so one clearly then, some of the proposals were set to have a trade-off on price stability, but then again, if we take different tools or a different institutional setup for tackling inflation, maybe this trade-off is smaller than it was perceived in a different worldview. And the other side, the financial stability mandate, maybe also inhibit some trade-offs that was not so much mentioned, but some of those proposals, for instance, excluding assets from assets purchase programs, could have an impact on the liquidity of this kind of assets. And we were wondering if this is kind of then already stranding financial assets, and then maybe it could have like transition risk from like the central bank transitioning, and how then, and this would then ultimately question the willingness of a central bank to actually then in moments of crisis to stick to this more proactive ideas of greening central banking. So I leave you actually with this question: is there a trade-off between greening central banking and financial supervision and financial stability?
Okay, so just going to a second critique that is less than a critique but more a call and spending on a specific topic that in this paper it's not super approached, but Professor Svartzman actually goes in depth on it in different papers, which is trying to elaborate on the differentiated challenges between the core and periphery central banks and financial supervisors. So I would like to start maybe like putting this idea that there is like a dual nature between the peripheral central banks financial supervisors challenges and the global north or the core ones. So in the first place, when we think about the ecological transition, and then both Nono and Professor mentioned a while ago, so there's this overarching constraints on how you can restructure central banks. Overall, they usually are related to some ideas on specific worldviews that can kind of like try to impose this autonomy of the central bank in a way that kind of like puts it away from a certain government steering of this transition, or as well the contradiction between the idea of having a short-term price stability need in opposition to a long-term horizon of ecological change. Or also central banks now are facing new sources of inflation, such as the climate inflation, fossil inflation, green inflation, all of these new sources that come with this challenge. And then on the other hand, for the peripheral central banks, you have this idea that is Bruno also mentioned extensively in his, we have a master class of currency hierarchy just now. So we have the international financial subordination that imposes structural constraints on the autonomy of those central banks due to like a certain, like a broad combination of factors that are related to their position in the international monetary and financial system. So the currency hierarchy then, it's basically, just summarizing a little bit, this idea that different national currencies, they're not equally capable of being at the international level what money traditionally needs to be, which is a unit of account, a means of payment, and a store of value. Just briefly bring in a little bit of like what Bruno also presented, how the peripheral currencies are basically at the bottom of this hierarchy. And then of course this idea that there are differentiated capacities of being liquid imposes additional challenges for peripheral central banks. So the fact that currencies are not liquid makes their assets and investments be broadly perceived as high risk investments, which demands a higher premium of this sort of peripheral, economies, which obligates then the central banks or the the monetary policy broadly to sustain high interest rates to attract foreign capital that profit from these differentials between core interest rates and peripheral interest rates, and that leads as well to an increased vulnerability to these market volatilities, to speculative attacks, and also the external policies, and then particularly, as I mentioned, the US domestic monetary policy that was also responsible for like several debt crises in Latin America in particular. So I guess here then my overall point is that we have this currency hierarchy and a high capital mobility that together create this limited policy space for these central banks, because they are in a constant need to react to these external changes and the pressures that they exert over the balance of payments, their foreign exchange reserves, and the overall interest rate as a monetary policy instrument. And that, of course, limits their ability to implement independent monetary policies that could promote this long-term development and economic stability. And then the literature basically states that we cannot deal with this change in central banks as in this one size fits all, as in the changes being like similar to all of them. And then my question is like, knowing that we need to address these imbalances on the international monetary financial system and create this new international political economy of central banking, how can we then conceptualize and implement these differentiated roles between core and periphery central banks, well, in a context of a broader global monetary policy coordination?
Thank you. So in this third, rather discussion than critique, I would like to shed the light a little bit more on political context, to understand some political questions and to understand what has been done, why, and what are some future projections related to combating these climate change challenges. And here, as you previously mentioned, NGFS and a little bit explained. I just want to mention it again, as I consider this, we consider this institution and network very much important for combating this issue, because it actually shows some best practices that are trying to manage climate and environmental risks in the financial system. And this institution is established in Paris, One Planet Summit in 2017, and interestingly, here I would like to correlate it to the past events that happened, namely in in December 2024, it had 144 members, as you just previously mentioned, and just this Friday, U.S. Federal Reserve announced its withdrawal from these institutions. And furthermore, I will try to mention some Fed stance and some potential underlying reasons behind that. The reason declared was that actually current scope of NGFS has been broadened that much that it get out of the outline of statutory mandate of Federal Reserve. And furthermore, we can also, it is important to mention ECB approach, and as European Central Bank acknowledges and the importance of embedding these climate and environmental risks in their policies. And this is shown in legal framework. To be more specific, in Article 127, you also mentioned Article 3, if I remember well. In the Article 127 Treaty of Functioning of the European Union, it is mentioned that it is emphasized that sustainable development should be pursued alongside also price stability. And this article connects, as we can see, with the Article 3, as previously mentioned, that highlights European Union's commitment to environmental protection alongside sustainable growth. And yeah, furthermore, coming back to Fed stance, you also mentioned, again, there's a lot of things that you have covered already in your presentation, but okay, this is a different quote, slightly different, but still the idea is the same. Climate change is an important issue. Yeah, Fed acknowledged, the chairman of the Fed, Powell, acknowledged that climate change is indeed important issue, but they are not going to deal with it. Like Congress is the one that should deal with it. That's how they perceive this issue. And yeah, I have stated some different limited rules. As previously just mentioned, it goes outside of Fed statutory mandate. Also, Republican skepticism. We have seen just yesterday that aside the U.S. Federal Reserve withdrawal, we have seen also that Trump signed withdrawal from Paris Agreement to combat climate change challenges. And yeah, also another example can be influence of U.S. fossil fuel industry, and they are probably lobbying over there. And I would also like to shed a light on some geopolitical considerations. For example, NGFS Secretariat is based in Bank of France, and the U.S. can perceive this probably as they can experience some discomfort with this, as we know that U.S. is mainly leader in whatever aliens we see them, and China also another thing is that China's active participation with NGFS could be concerned, especially amidst the U.S.-China tension. Finally, again, previously mentioned, but U.S. is already known as a major oil and gas producer, and these industries, these sectors, energy sectors, can strongly conflict the green finance goals and objectives. And ultimately, I would like to conclude and to ask whether it's feasible for central banks to expand their mandates to incorporate green policies within the framework of capitalism, and or does system inherently limit such transformations? Thank you.
Great. I was rushing to write the question, but good to have it. So thanks so much to the three of you for this feedback and questions. I found them sincerely super interesting and very broad, also coming from very different perspective. So yeah, I'm trying to think how to cover this without taking another hour. So perhaps going. I was just checking a few notes that I took on the first one, because I think that actually the first and the third one actually can be sort of connected a little bit because I mean, you say much more than this question actually, so that's why I was wondering, would I focus on the question or more broadly? But perhaps keeping question 1 and 3 in mind. For me, there's this question of the mandates of central banks. I would say that it's not necessarily like the key issue where I would say like this is really what needs to be challenged. And I know that a lot of the debates take place there, and it takes place there both because of like orthodox and heterodox perspective, and like we can even see like in the case it was interesting when for instance Argentina moved from like the Macri government to Alberto Fernandez and then to Milei, and like in their negotiation with the IMF, there's always this idea that and it was actually when Macri went to the IMF for like the first like huge loan in around 2015-16, one of the requests of the IMF is like, hey, you need to change again the Carta Magna, I think like the mandate of the central bank. You need to explicitly say again it is independent. So there's a lot of pressure on both sides, and there are some papers, including by Simon Dickow and Uli Volz, showing that in general developing countries tend to have like a broader mandate than high-income countries. So the thing for me with the mandates, like, of course, I want the central banks personally to have like a rather slightly broader than narrow mandates because of my own, I would say, political bias, the way I see things. But I think that it doesn't, whatever the mandate is, it doesn't tell you how you're going to act, what are you going to do precisely in different situations. And you know, like for instance, this question of market neutrality that I mentioned, it's interesting because it's mentioned in a lot of places. You know, like when like whatever you do, like in the central bank, when I worked 5 years for the French central bank, and like there would be like, oh, but this is not market neutral and so on. And at some point, one of my former director told me one day, like, hey, you know what? Market neutrality is defined nowhere. Like, you know, like you will not find a definition of market neutrality. So that was quite interesting for me because it was like, wow, this is something like it's an operational stuff that was like pushed for mostly, I guess, in this case by the Bundesbank. I mean, I guess now I'm quite sure, but you know, like where that insisted a lot on that, but actually it was not defined. So it's like there's a lot of room for doing a lot of things, whatever the mandate is. So I think that's, yeah, it's you know, like I think that there's with the current mandate where you say, you know, like it's price stability, it's financial stability, you can support a little bit the government, more or less. You could work on a lot of things. One of the ideas I'm interested in, I've never really worked on that yet, and I don't know like how to approach it, but it would be like a kind of coordination where the central banks, it would be like disguised coordination to some extent, where the central bank explicitly say at some point, hey, you know what, I cannot deal with this. For instance, what would have happened if at the beginning of the inflationary pressure we had in the post-COVID and then war in Ukraine situation, what if the ECB had said like to these governments like, hey, you know what, I'm going to increase interest rate if you don't do anything as governments, like because at some point it's going to impact me, but this is for you to do this job. And this is not something that central banks do, because like they decide, given in their idea of independence, to say, how did they act? For 1 year, they say, this is temporary, this is temporary, this is temporary. That's all they said. We're going to look through that, we're going to look through that. And at some point during this year, you had like more like the hawkish, you know, like people at the ECB who wanted, in any case, to increase interest rate. They wanted to get rid of all the QE and so on. So they're like pushing until they win this battle. But there was a room, I think, for different form of coordination, even within these mandates. So for me, it's much more, it goes back to like, what are the institutional arrangement? Who's putting pressure on the central bank? You know, like, are we in a place like fiscal policy could take place without the central bank authorizing it? You know, like, there could be more, you know, like at least, and I'm not talking about question 2 here, but at least in core countries, there is, you know, like the ability to conduct more active fiscal policies, and you could do that without the central bank. The question would be like, is the central bank gonna, within its mandate, sort of like let you go, give you a hand, or is it gonna play like the opposite game, basically? And this is where I would say, like, okay, within the mandate we can do a lot of things, but then the question is that a lot of trade-off are gonna appear. And for instance, I think personally, this is not, you know, like a super fancy scenario I have in mind and so on, but here, as I said, there are 2 EPOG students who are going to work on the question of inflation, transition, and inflation, and that's something I'm increasingly working on. So, you know, like, hopefully I will have more insight into this. But for me, like, I want to see like a scenario of transition where prices, you know, like where wages, in the agricultural sector are increased, for instance. I want to see an increase in agricultural prices, in wages, in many sectors. That's something I want to see. And you could say that I want to see some inflationary pressure. So basically, how is the central bank gonna deal with this trade-off? That's the main question. Like, is the central bank gonna say, well, actually, it's true that you know, like you know, like we have inflation, but we're helping the government? No, but could it say within its mandate, we're going to revisit a little bit the inflation target, which is what they've been doing over the past few years a little bit, you know, like to say, hey, you know what, we're going to revisit them because maybe 2%, we shouldn't be too strict about it. It could be a bit more during a certain time. And you could say, you know, like it will be like, I could be like, you know, like a pure politician, like a pure, like kind of like, you know, like a very, you know, like mainstream central banker saying like, oh yeah, actually the problem is that if we cut inflation right now, we're going to cut the ability of, if we increase interest rate right now and cut the ability to deliver a transition, this is going to increase transition risk in the physical risk in the future and potential transition risk. So the best way to deal with it is to let inflation go a bit up while not, you know, like while preserving financial stability over a long term. Like you could perfectly within the mandate kind of like, you know, like navigate a little bit this trade-off you would have. I'm not saying it's easy, but you could definitely do them. Another way, you know, like another discussion within central banks, like how should you treat real estate prices, right? Depending on how you count real estate prices, today they are basically not really accounted for in inflation in inflation figures. I mean, part of it when you're an owner, like in your repayments. I mean, there's a little bit of real estate prices that can be like, you know, like integrated a little bit into a measure of inflation, but mostly they're not. And this is super political, but you don't need to change everything in your mandate. You know, like you could deal with a trade-off a bit differently. You could say to the central bank, hey, I'm going to better, and there are discussions at the ECB on that. How should we account for the price of real estate? Because this is a huge impact. But then, you know, like you see a lot of mainstream economists saying, oh yeah, people have wrong feelings. They think there's inflation, there's no inflation. It's like, no, people really understand that real price, you know, like resale prices, the rent is going up, and we're not measuring it as part of inflation. So they're really feeling things. I don't think that, you know, people have like wrong anticipations, things like this. And then like, you know, like the central banks can really, like, it cannot solve all these issues, but I think like within the mandate, it can also dare say, hey, you know what, we're going to measure it in a way that is going to be more socially acceptable. They don't need to say it. They can just do it, saying it reflects better, you know, like really the cost of life, to have, you know, like a better integration of a real estate, because in the end, you know, like this is very important, and it could even, you know, like anchor future expectations or blah, 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 future anticipations. You know, like you could really use the mainstream language and change things. So I would say that yeah, there are a lot of trade-offs that are going to appear, and for me, it's like where do central bankers stand on that? And today we know that, you know, like central bankers, it goes back to like who they are, what kind of economic training they have. I think even like more like political issues than that. But I would say that they would tend to have like a rather like conservative approach whenever the trade-off emerge. But it should not be the case, not always be the case. There are, you know, like ways to navigate that a little bit. Sorry if it's like not a super clear-cut response, but I would say, you know, like if I wanted to be super clear on that, I would say, in my opinion, no need to, you know, like, I'm fine with changing to expand the mandate, but I wouldn't fight on that. And yet, is there a trade-off? There are many trade-offs, but there are ways of navigating them, of like smoothing them. That will be like the short answer. This one for me is like, it's much more difficult. I'm tempting to give the micro to Bruno, like he says now. No, but it's really a very difficult one. Like, how do we treat them differently? This is something that I have not worked on actually, because I work a lot on the question of I work a bit on the question of core and periphery hierarchies. I work on the question of central bank, but not on merging them. And if I haven't worked on that, it's because I don't know how to think about that. I think it is sort of like a question that I'm really lost with when it comes to like, okay, how do we? Because I think that the problem is that who is the authority that should be transnational, I guess, by definition? What is the authority that determines, you know, like the different role of central banks and financial supervisor in this country? So I have a hard time like just conceptualizing the framework, unless I'm become very idealistic. You know, like there are some papers which I like. You know, like I think there was one in RIPE, a review of international political economy recently, about, you know, like this idea of like how we could create a lot of green special drawing reserve, special drawing rights, sorry, SDRs, to fund the transition, so on. And I have, you know, like a sympathy for that, but I don't think that. I think it's more on an idealistic level when we talk about this very broad proposal. Like in practice, I guess it goes more to like, to a question of like who's going to help you say, you know, that like, you know, like it's fine as a central bank in the periphery. You shouldn't suffer so much from the ability to conduct independent monetary policy versus focusing on your exchange rate. What are the authorities doing that? Private investors are probably not going to help you there. You know, like it's not definitely not their job. Could it be somehow the job a little bit of like multilateral development banks and IMF? You know, like would they have a role there? I guess they would have a role in the way in which, you know, like they would negotiate with you. But yeah, it's something that is like such, that goes to much broader question. That was, for instance, in one of my papers with Jeff Althaus on this question. Precisely, one of our ideas was to say, let's be a bit careful with the proposal that want to solve the issue through monetary solutions, you know, like such as green SDR and so on, because in the end, these countries, if they are so vulnerable financially, it's also, I mean, more or less, I don't want to say all peripheral countries are equally vulnerable, but if they are more vulnerable, it's also a big part because of their their lower rank somehow in the productive hierarchy, their inability to add more value, you know, like it goes back basically to structuralists, you know, like in Latin America, for instance. So it goes much beyond monetary policy. But yeah, I would say, you know, like if I wanted to be on a sort of in between idealistic and realistic level, and I could say, you know, like, okay, we know that, you know, like the IMF, the World Bank, the Fed are not really doing that, except in specific cases. For instance, you know, like during the COVID crisis, the Fed developed these swap lines with like friendly countries. So like it's alleviated a little bit the financial pressure for some countries that it shows. But you know, like could the EU have a different view on that? I know it's not going to happen today with the current political arrangement, but could the EU, you know, like try to develop like different deals with this country, like go for like a different, like for, you know, like for different kind of swaps, for instance, as is China is doing with some Latin American countries and African countries. Could the EU do that as well with a different, I would say, priorities, more tailored toward the ecological transition? So maybe there are proposals to be made like along these lines, but otherwise, yeah, I feel that it's a very, very hard question, and I'm sorry I'm not answering it better. But yeah. And again, thanks a lot, and I have my other notes here, so maybe I'll get back to you when I read my notes.
So let's open the floor.
Thank you for the presentation. I am Andresa from Brazil. I would like to know your thoughts on adopting sectorial approach to address inflation. For instance, should other policies at the government level play a more important role in stabilizing specific sectors, such as buffer stocks for manage food inflation? What would be the limitations of this approach? And maybe if price stability is partially achieved through supply side interventions, could this create a room to central banks to use interest rates setting more strategically, such as implementing differentiated lending rates based on environmental impact of banks, portfolios, etc.?
Thank you. I'm Jan from Germany, and I wanted to ask you that, I mean, in a lot of these approaches, the central bank, what it can do to maybe finance the green transition is really framed around lending and credit. So it's always like a classic bank that also at some point wants it to be paid back and maybe even get like a little return. And I think you wrote a different paper on that where you criticized the ecological macroeconomics and the idea of green investment, if we should question that, and if like in green investment always yields this return that can then be paid back to the central bank at some point. And so do you think there is maybe some more room for grants that are not necessary, or like non-borrowed funds for the green transition, and not like non-borrowed funds, so that don't need to be paid back at some point?
Hello, I'm Isabella from Brazil, and I was wondering, have any concrete actions been done so far by the central banks beyond the central bank stress test? If you can give some examples, would be nice. And also I wanted to ask you, because this thing of not measuring the risks, I think that in practice we do to call also the attention of policymakers, which can be ethically questioned. And there is also like the capturing interest, like there is this controversy of the task force on nature-related financial disclosures being like captured by lobbying, and yeah, I was wondering your thoughts on that. Thank you.
So let's have a first round of responses. So thanks a lot. Yeah, the first question, I'm definitely on the side of thinking that, you know, like that the recent episode of inflation should have dealt with primarily, you know, like well managed government intervention with like a buffer stock, with like a price controls and so on. So I really think that you know, like well, that you know, like what, for instance, the work that Isabella Weber did, and even though perhaps now it's easy to say, oh, maybe she hadn't like seen everything. The question of like, was it like, she didn't never mention greedflation, but whether it was really a price wage spiral, now it can be a bit criticized and so on. But you know, like at the time, I think she brought great value in saying that the two teams somehow, like the you know, like the temporary team, like this is temporary, it will pass, and kind of like, you know, like let's increase interest rate. That both of them were wrong, and I think that like I really admire her for like bringing that back in 2021, I think. So I think that this is really, it was the way to go. Now, could have central banks said, okay, you know, like given that this is the government, then we're gonna, you know, like keep using interest rate like quite strategically. Yes and no, because to some extent you could say that before the COVID crisis, they were using it strategically. Central, like interest rates were in some countries negative. You know, like, and I remember at the time, like in 2019, sometimes going to conferences, and it was funny. Like there was once I was at a conference with someone from, I think it's M&G, like a big asset manager, and like an investor there saying kind of like, you know, like this is like finance 101. When you have like negative interest rates, if you don't get into debt, is not that, oh, you could have got into that. It's like you're making a big mistake. Like it was like fiscal policy not using something that was there, not exactly to support the government, but they had like a huge opportunity to massively borrow. And so I think that, you know, like this relates a little bit to this question, like what else could have they done? You know, kind of like go and knock at the door of the treasurer. It's like, please borrow now. Like it's so for me, like this question of strategy would have, yeah, it was more really on the fiscal policy side. I don't want to say that central bank have done everything perfectly and so on, but to some extent, I wouldn't blame them for these specific issues. Now another thing is that assuming that you have like that you have supply-led inflation as we had, and you have this government intervention, you're going to have impacts elsewhere, right? For instance, on public debts. So it goes back to some extent. The question goes back to like, how is the central bank going to deal with that? You know, like is at some point, like, are you working in a scenario where investors say, okay, sure, there's like an increasing public debt, but we still believe in that? Or do they start losing confidence? And if they start losing confidence, how does the central bank react? Because it has a huge ability, of course, to influence the price of public debt. And then there you would have like other, you know, like other issues, strategic issues. For me, again, going back to the question about, you know, like the flexibility you have within your mandate, you know, like it would be doable for a central bank to kind of like integrate climate-related risk within sovereign bonds in a way where kind of like you support a bit more governments, you know, like to say, okay, sure, you've been more in debt, but actually this is for the transition, so it's for a good cause, so I'm still accepting that, you know, like as a very good collateral, or, you know, like I can like provide more loans, you know, like this existed in the post-war in France, for instance, central bank, you know, like lending at better conditions to commercial banks that were investing in sovereign bonds, so you could still use this kind of strategy. So I think there is some room for that, but part of the room has not been exploited by fiscal policy, and even when inflation was high, because like, you know, like I mean when interest rates were increased, because you know, like in real terms it's still like very low debts. I mean, debt with very low real interest rates. So, you know, like there's now there, for those of you who follow a bit more like French news, you may have seen that, you know, like there's this economist called François Gérolf who is a bit outraged because every time someone uses this idea, which percent of the budget is now used to pay interest rates. And he's saying like this is the wrong way of looking at it, because, you know, like if in the end even if the total of interest rate has increased, but in fact you got into a debt that is a negative in the end in real terms, this is still a good deal. So it's just the wrong way of looking at it. So there is still kind of like opportunities out there for fiscal policy to exploit. So I think it's it's more on the fiscal policy side. On the second question, when you say non-borrowed fund, just to be clear, like what are you referring to? Like more.
I think I was more referring to grants mostly, like the idea that.
But from whom? I mean, from.
Because I mean, there's a central bank basically also distributes more grants rather than.
Okay, so that it's like monetary financing to some extent. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, for me it's like I was just having a chat with someone who's Rudy Bougeli. You may know him. He teaches a little bit at EPOG about that, where there are some proposals made along these lines about monetary financing. There's also, like, for instance, some French authors, Isabelle Coupé-Soubeyran and others, who talk about, I'm not sure I fully understood, but they talk about some sort of like non-debt money that would be created by central bank. I have to say I'm not fully clear on what they propose, but for me the thing is that if I look at it from a almost anthropological perspective, I love David Graeber. I'm like, yeah, everything is possible. Money is a social convention. We can do whatever we want, right? It's like there's a lot we can do. Now, if I look at it from more of a political economy perspective, within the current regime of let's call it financialized capitalism, even it may not be the best term, but let's look at it that way. That like we may want to get out of it, but this is where we are. We have to move strategically. I really don't see the central bank saying like suddenly it's kind of like, hey, you know what? Money is a social convention. I could create money and and use it for the ecological transition. And it's crazy because actually central banks have been creating money to buy financial assets in time of crisis, and nobody sees trouble there. Like it's kind of like this is fine. Like at the beginning of COVID, it was crazy. Like when the lockdown occurred in France. Stock markets went down. I think it was like, but also in the US, many places, like it was the biggest fall in one day in stock markets, bigger than 2007, than 1987, than 1929. And for instance, in the case of the EU, it was really funny because like you had the ECB announcing we're gonna issue I don't remember if it was 700 billion first and then 600 billion. I think it was like we're gonna issue 750 billion to buy assets for it, basically, like to expand QE. Markets start reacting, and just a few days later, like, you know what, we're going to add 600 billion. So 1.35 trillion created just like this, right, to buy financial assets. And that's fine because we're in the, that's fine. I mean, from, like, investor don't care, like capitalism keeps working and so on. But if you start doing it for the purpose of the ecological transition to fund like households or governments, you're just like, how could I put it? You're just like breaking the pillar of the system. Like it makes me think about Kaleski's paper and like the political aspect of full employment. It's perfectly doable, but you're just like destroying the very ability of the capitalists himself or herself to kind of like to justify his position in the system. So it's kind of like you're changing the whole system, and that's the issue I have with the people who make like concrete proposal about monetary financing, grants, where I'm like, I see it, I like broadening my mental like views and so on, but this is like implementing elements of something that is like completely non-capitalist into a capitalist system. So I just have a hard time, like, I really don't want to say I'm not interested in that because I am, but I have a very hard time saying like how realistic it is versus how idealistic it is. Yeah, that's where I would be a bit, like I would not, if tomorrow, I don't know, I was an advisor to the governor of Banque de France, I wouldn't tell him like, hey, just create the money, that's fine. Like I think I wouldn't do it. I would be afraid of all the consequences of doing that, basically. But I'm in favor of a society where this exists. So it's, and then on the third question, yeah, on the concrete actions, there are very few concrete actions. So the ECB has been making a few of them. Like for instance, in the collateral, I very briefly mentioned it, but for the collateral framework, now they give priority to greener assets than like fossil-based assets. For the corporates, for like the part of the QE of quantitative easing that was about corporate, so most of them was about sovereign bonds, but so small part was for corporate bonds, and they also like tilted it toward like greener issuers. I don't remember the criteria they used. I think one of them was the current emission by sector. I think like a ratio of emission by euro of turnover, something like this. But then they had like also what was the trend of the firm to see like, okay, maybe you're the best in your sector and you've been improving, so you're going, like the tilting will be favorable to you. But that was a bit, like the corporate purchases are a small part of all this. And also they announced that just when interest rates were already started like to increase, they were kind of like reducing this QE. So they started doing like I don't think it's really a game changer. Then do we have like, I think in China they had like a few credit lines that are like sort of like I don't know if it's TLTRO. TLTRO is like the targeting long-term refinancing operation. So, for instance, the ECB had done that with bank for SMEs. Like they give you loans at lower interest rate with the idea that you invest that in SMEs. The problem is that in the case of ECB, there were like no way of really of verifying that, so it was a bit weird. But I think China has been doing a little bit with green loans, trying to get favorable loans to banks that invest in transition. I don't know if they're still doing it, how it works. And most of the action have been taking on like the so-called pillar 3, so like about disclosure. So it's also something that I find a bit, when I was working for a central bank, that I would find a bit frustrating, which was that many central banks, kind of like, I feel that they use also a little bit this risk assessment as a way also of delaying concrete actions. It's like, oh, it's super difficult. It turns out we have underestimated risk. We're going to use another model. We're going to do it better. We're going to use like, now they're doing it, for instance, they use like stronger damage functions. So now physical risks are getting higher in the NGFS scenario and so on. It's like, okay, but what does it mean? And no one is really thinking about that because like, like most of them are like measuring risk. So I think this is a bit annoying. And then, yeah, the question of lobbies that you mentioned, for me, of course, it's strong, it exists. And for me, there's like something that a bit more, I mentioned it very briefly when I say in that beginning, like, or formally central banks say, oh, we care about that because, like there are risks and so on. So now we have identified this risk and so, but for me, like they wouldn't have really moved forward if the private sector was not kind of like interested in that. And I think that there's a lot of influence. I wouldn't say there's like a hidden lobby or things like this, but I would say that like central bankers tend to be very pro-market, and they would go toward the direction when they see that like BlackRock is creating a new like green product. And and for instance, in the case of biodiversity nature, I saw that very clearly because when I was at the French central bank, I started working on saying, hey, we need to go beyond climate. And like no one was interested. It was like, what is that? And when the TNFD was the task force for nature-related financial disclosure was created, I really saw kind of like like central bankers saying like, hey, actually, like it could make sense, it could be interesting, but no one told me oh, you're gonna do it because TNFD does it because like they're independent, like they're really and even if you have lunch with like a private banker, things like this, it's very controlled, so you cannot accuse them of being like sold to the private bankers. But in practice, I think that like the private finance has a huge influence on like what is the horizon of possibilities of the central banker. So I think it's something that explains quite a lot, and it will be interesting now to see like there was this coalition of asset managers. How is it called? GAFSZN? I don't remember. Like coalition of like big asset managers, like committing to invest in environmental issues at large, and now there has been a big backlash against ESG. Now many of these, I think BlackRock actually withdrew from this coalition, and I would be quite interested in seeing, like, I wouldn't be surprised if central banks kind of like also slow down because I see that private finance is not on board. But so yeah, I think they are influenced perhaps more ideologically than by lobby. I wouldn't say by lobby.
Sylvain from France. I was thinking last week there was Jean-Claude Trichet, not here, but at Sorbonne University. The subject was inflation, and I think there is another subject for central bank, which is financial stability, which is mentioned, and even him says that, and there were also Anne Petitfort last week, that they not together. Maybe, okay, but there was like maybe a huge bubble. So there is even him. I think maybe somebody would say no, I misunderstood, but that it will burst. The problem of financial stability is there, and I think all time, and it's never solved. I mean, there is this possibility to use what it did in COVID in 2008 as buying assets or creating money or bonds for government to kind of just ease the situation. But I think that it's never solved. I mean, things can happen again, and we don't know what will happen next time, how bad it will be. So I wonder how we can reposition the responsibility that the central bank have, because I think this is I think they go. And I don't know who has the responsibility of the situation. I mean, is it the government or the central bank? Well, and it's very linked also, I think, to many other things. I mean, we want to make the system to continue, people being able to speculate by in buildings and all things, and all I think in your presentation we see that all things goes together, and it's just I wonder what kind of how to link politics and economy again, because I think it's the main question, because it's, well, just how can we direct things toward just a green society or whatever you call it, because I think that if we don't have this question of responsibility, maybe it will happen. Sorry.
Sarah from Germany. It's also a bit of a big picture question, maybe. With like the current backlash against climate policies, and also perhaps the crumbling of even this risk view of green monetary policy, I was wondering whether you see this risk view within central banks as a sort of precondition for the rest of the debate to even take place, or what would you say can, for instance, this third perspective that I would also find most interesting happen even if within central banks there isn't even a clear case for having this risk-based treatment of climate policies? Like, yeah, basically, where do you see the discussion standing? Should it maybe, from a strategic perspective, shift towards defending the risk-based approach, or is it worthwhile to go beyond that?
Hi, I'm Samuel from Germany, and I have a question regarding the issue of uncertainty in risk modeling and in stress tests, and to what degree maybe alternative, preferably heterodox models could have maybe an advantage or a better approach, or is there a way in which they could incorporate this issue better, or would you say that's just a universal limitation, and also too tied to the risk-based approach? That's my question.
Hi, I'm Arthur from the Netherlands, and I was interested by your view on like finding the wiggle room within the current existing mandate already. And I was thinking, would you be able to go as far as saying it is in the ECB's interests to finance the green transition, because if you say that price stability in the long run is the goal of the ECB, and currently one of the ways in which inflation can happen is through energy shocks, as we saw with the invasion of Ukraine, and a renewable energy system would be sort of insulated from these type of oil shocks, would you be able to sort of change the narrative and say that this would fall within the price stability in the long run mandate?
So thanks for this additional round of question. On the first one about this idea of bubbles, I think that there's definitely part of the responsibility, I think, it lies with central bank. Like I was just answering to the colleague just behind you. I don't remember his name, sorry, but about like this idea of monetary creation, where like huge monetary creation to save financial markets on havoc, but you create like price high, you create more moral hazards. So it's I think it's there now. The question, like, will there be like an even broader, like an even like larger and even more like painful crisis in the end? I'm not so sure, in the sense that I think it depends on whether you think that there's a fundamental value of things or not. and personally, I don't think that there's a fundamental value. Like I work a little bit in finance. I remember by the time I arrived and a few years later with like it was my first job, and it was right at the beginning of the financial crisis, like the ratio, like the PER, price equity ratio and so on, they had changed a lot. Like sometimes like it's 5, then it's like 20. Like it's depending on like the past few years. So like, is there like a price where at some point everyone says, no, this is too much, now there's going to be a crisis? Or is it something that like it's socially constructed? And for me, where it bursts, but it's purely me as a citizen speaking, it's not at all like academic or whatever, is that it's socially. And that like that the impact of maintaining that, if there's no crisis, it's like more and more inequality between asset owners, capital owners, and the rest. And I think that it is like socially unsustainable, basically. And we're seeing that. You mentioned the question of real estate. Like real estate in big cities, like they become completely disconnected from from workers of these big cities. And is this gonna generate a crisis necessarily? I don't know, but I think it generates like a lot of discontents, a lot of like willingness to go against the system and so on, and also for good reason. But that can can lead you to crazy elected politicians also. So I'm unsure about like in the end whether there will be like the biggest crisis ever, or whether the central bank will be there and to save things, but yeah, to some extent, like connecting politics and economics, I would say that by saving the financial system, it's kind of like it moves toward politics, the problem. But it's just my my own view on that, and maybe like it's there could also be a crisis. But for me, it's always a big question: what would have happened in 2008 if Lehman Brothers are if fiscal and monetary authorities had not enabled Lehman Brothers to go bankrupt? Would we have had still a global financial crisis just 6 months later, or would we have had something more like the COVID, where like a huge disconnect between like the so-called real economy and financial markets performance? That's it's. I'm sure that many post-Keynesians have much more interesting things to say about that than me, but for me, it's like it's really a huge question. And yeah. Then Sarah's question about the backlash, that's a big question for me. Like until recently I was kind of like, this risk-based approach, I don't like it. And when I was working in the central bank, I was trying to push things forward. But we have to acknowledge that, it's central bankers themselves who have sort of shaped this debate and contributed and made it emerge. So yes, I am concerned that it completely disappears. And even many heterodox scholars have started to work on the question of central banks, because there was more openness there than with fiscal authorities, treasuries, and you're like, kind of like, hey, yeah, you're like, there's this opportunity. It's a way of bringing different questions about monetary money endogeneity, about like different models, which links to the next question. So, so yeah, what if this disappear? Can we still have like view number 2, view number 3, or does it become completely somehow useless because we would be talking about like things on which central banks would not even longer be working on? So. So yeah, I am quite concerned about the next step of the NGFS, which was already quite weakened, I think, because it grew a lot, which was good. Everyone wanted to be part of it, but as it grew, it also lost a little bit its ability to say, hey, let's work on that. And with like many central banks and financial supervision authorities who joined, and then were kind of like pulling things a bit backward whenever there was a new idea. So yeah, let's see what happens. But I am concerned, and yeah, I would say that like at my level, of course, I would keep working on that. But yeah, I don't know how much traction it would get. Yeah, so I don't know. Yeah, and on the Samuel's question about the uncertainty in the stress test, I think it could have helped indeed. There's still, nevertheless, I would say that the like the whole ecological SFC modeling world, it's also still in its infancy. Again, it's a field that like in 2015, there was, when I started my thesis, there was I think one like working paper by Yanis Dafermos and Marie-Noelle, where they were like discussing it conceptually. And I don't remember if there was anything else on ecological SFC. So it's like really, really young. So I would say that we shouldn't like, we need more time to have more, like there are quite a few models emerging now, like a lot of, I don't know, like you may know like Drew Jackson, who worked with Tim Jackson, he's working on a new model. There, Yanis Dafermos is developing Define, Irene Monasterolo has her model. Many people have like, are like building like SFC or SFC compatible kind of model. But I would say that some sources of uncertainty remain, and also some difficulties, like to capture, depending on what your scenario is. Because if you want to have just a different view of like the interaction between the energy sector and the financial system, and to have your balance sheets and your like account and so yeah, it makes sense. But if you want to have like a broader, if your scenario is about like a reversal of of North-South relation, about like China becoming a new leader in green technologies and so on, like at some point it still escapes the model a little bit. And that's an experience I made, for instance, working a little bit with Jean-François Mercure and Hector Pollitt with this which I think could be called like a post-Keynesian compatible model, I would say. And it's super interesting. They have a lot of things to look at, stranded assets and so on, which actually relate to one of the points made by Miloš, right, about and I don't know if I'm pronouncing your name right, so which was about the like the US perhaps not wanting to work that much on these things because they're exposed also to like to stranded assets, and this like we could really see that with the model and so on. But at some point you have to make assumptions for the future about who's going to develop the new technology, where, and at which cost. And it goes back to like, and I would go even further. What is the worldview supporting that? Are we going to build this, like, let's say it's electric vehicle with like lithium batteries? Okay, fine. And then is it to build like a SUV, individual SUVs of 2 tons per capita, like when each person with one SUV, or is it more for public transportation? So we still have these big questions that remain. And just today I saw that the IPBES, which is sort of the IPCC of biodiversity, is launching, I think, a group, and they have a conference soon about how can models in general, it's not about Hertog's models, but how can models better integrate different worldviews, different, like conception, different scenarios that today they tend to ignore a little bit. So I'd say that many sources of uncertainty are still there, but yes, it would have helped a lot to start with something else. And yeah. And that's something that was very, I mean, that experience that from the central bank, the big difficulty to propose alternative. I'm not a modeler myself, but I was close enough to many modelers, and I would say knowledgeable enough of some Keynesian models to like to that I was able to sort of like make the case for that. And I would see like that it was complete. The door was really closed there. Now it's opening a little bit, I think, but it tends to be closed. last question is yeah, this interest of ECB in like potential, basically if I understood correctly, ECB could say, hey, you know what, I'm going to work on the transition because like it's going to be good for us in terms of like financial stability, right? Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely something that could be done, and maybe it's a matter of time, assuming that like the central banks keep working on that. But there was something that I think was a bit missing when it comes to environmental issues, was precisely this coordination, financial stability and price stability, because there is a stream of research now within mainstream econ about like the trade-off between financial stability and price stability. So you have some work on that, but when it comes to environmental issues, to climate change, I don't think it's been used. So it's central banks could definitely start working on that with always one big question, which is the time horizon. And I mentioned Mark Carney's speech, which was sort of like the kickoff of this whole field. And I don't love this speech, but I think that it has like a few very interesting and powerful points. And one of them is really about this time horizon of, not only central banks or policymakers in general, but like in the case of central banks, it's difficult for you to call for financial stability over the long term. I tried to do that at my first year at Banque de France. For instance, I had worked on a report called the Green Swan with people from the Bank for International Settlement and so on. And that's kind of like the argument we use to say like it is of interest, playing with the mandate again a little bit, to say we don't change the mandate, but no one said that the mandate was only 3 years, for instance. So we need to have a longer term horizon. So it's more about the practice, how we use the mandate. So I think that there is a case to do that, but I wouldn't, I don't expect that to be a big game changer. I would say that it's definitely the way to go if you work within a central bank and you want to make things, change a little bit at your level. This is definitely an argument you can use, but I don't think that, at the institutional level, the central bank would shift its entire policies because of that, unfortunately.